Good afternoon and welcome to FBI-LEEDA's webinar series. We are committed to advancing the science and art of law enforcement leadership. These webinars are designed to promote the exchange of information to improve law enforcement practices during a time of crisis when our physical classes have been placed on hold. This and all previous webinars are recorded for future viewing and posted to the FBI-LEEDA website. Certificates of participation will be emailed to all Zoom registered attendees along with related presentation materials. These webinars are not currently post-certified. Visit FBILEEDA.org for the most up-to-date webinar information. Today, our Director of Curriculum, Dr. Neil Moore, will be joined by Michael Mason, Senior Vice President and Chief of Security Officer at Verizon. Without further ado, Dr. Neil Moore.
Okay, thank you, Laura. Welcome to everyone. We're glad to have you back again in our webinar series. Today's topic, we're kind of deviating a little bit from the COVID things that we've talked about over the last several weeks, but this topic is really, really critical. I'm an old retired guy, and I had to make a transition from policing to something that was non-policing. And so that's going to be kind of where we're going to go with our very special guest here. And let me give you a little bit of his background. What a purposeful life this man is living. Michael Mason joined Verizon in January 2008 as the company's chief security officer. He oversees and coordinates global security efforts throughout Verizon and all of its business units, including the enterprise-wide security strategy and programs, physical security, elements of cybersecurity, legal compliance, investigations, and law enforcement matters. In 2014, Mr. Mason was recognized by Security 500 magazine as one of 2014's most influential security executives, and in 2017, Black Enterprise magazine named him one of the top 300 Black executives. Immediately prior to joining Verizon, Mr. Mason was an executive assistant director, an EAD, with the Federal Bureau of Investigation in charge of the Bureau's Criminal, Cyber Response, and Services branch. As a former EAD, Mr. Mason is one of three most senior African-American executives in the FBI's history. In 2004, he was the recipient of the Presidential Rank Award for Meritorious Executive Service. This is awarded to the top 5% of federal government executives in the nation. He began his career as a special agent in the New Haven field office, working investigations ranging from undercover narcotics cases to general crimes and public corruption. Mr. Mason served in many senior leadership positions, including serving as a special agent in charge of the Sacramento field office and the assistant director in charge of the Washington field office, the FBI's second largest field unit. He also has a military background, a very strong military background, serving in the United States Marine Corps from 1980 to 1985. Also, he is a graduate with a bachelor's degree in accounting from Illinois Western University. And in 2007, Mr. Mason was recognized as the Distinguished Alumni of the Year, and he currently sits on the Illinois Wesleyan University Board of Trustees, where he has served since 2010. He's also very active civically, sitting on the advisory board of the Alliance for Hope International, an organization focused on the eradication of domestic violence, both domestically and internationally, and he sits as a board of director member for Hostage USA, a nonprofit organization dedicated to helping the families of individuals who've been kidnapped on foreign soil. Mr. Mason is a native of Chicago, proud father of two adult sons, his eldest serving in the Washington State Patrol as a trooper, and his youngest as a captain in the United States Marine Corps. So with that said, Michael, wow, what a pleasure to have you here, and especially on this topic, because we know you're passionate about this issue. And like I said, I'm an old retired guy, and one of the things that happened in my life was as I know that retirement date is coming, and we all get that realization at some point, you start thinking, what's next? What am I going to do next? Because in policing, many of us get the opportunity to retire while we're still reasonably young and still reasonably fit. So why don't you give us just kind of some of your opening thoughts?
Well, one of the things is I would want everybody to know who's watching this presentation, I have a genuine passion for this, Neil. I had a lot of counselors, a lot of mentors helping me out as I was making my own transition, which is inevitable for all of us. And then when I got to Verizon, I met additional mentors. So I don't think of a mentor as being something that just a 20-year-old has. I think it's okay for somebody like me, a 62-year-old, to have. But one of the things that I wanted to do, because I saw over and over and over again how long it was taking senior members of the law enforcement community to make an effective transition, to land someplace that they were going to be happy, where they could have an extended career and learn that there is life after law enforcement. Listen, I love every day that I worked in the FBI. I don't think I worked a major case that I didn't have help from a local department, a state department, or another federal agency. So all I'm doing now is paying it forward. I'm paying the good fortune I had forward to your audience here today.
Okay, thanks, and it's really good to have you here. I'm going to let you take control of directing Laura as we need to move through the presentation you have. So we're really going to talk about life after law enforcement and trying to prepare for that transition. Just an entry question, Michael. Do police departments and did the FBI do a good job of helping you start to transition?
Well, there was an FBI network, but it wasn't so much of a formal organization. In other words, it didn't exist within the organization. They help you prepare you to retire, but not to transition. And what I want to make it clear to everybody here today is I think of this as a professional transition. You may be retiring from the law enforcement community, but what comes next? And how do we prepare for that? And in law enforcement, we are so purposeful about everything that we do, except when it comes to taking care of ourselves. And so what I want to do is help people, first of all, to get over the fact that you think you're abandoning the mothership. And so many of us are that way. We don't even want to talk about retirement out loud, but it is something that's an inevitable fact of our life eventually. And so what I want to do is, again, share some things with this audience that I think will help make that transition, help make the time between they have an ideation about retiring and they land someplace good, making that time shorter. That's what I'd like to do. That's my objective today.
Okay, all righty, good. Hey, well, I've been a cop all my professional life. What makes me an attractive candidate for a position in the private sector?
Well, you know, the one thing I hear oftentimes, Neil, from our colleagues in the law enforcement community, somebody will say to me, Mike, I've been a cop for 30 years. It's all I've ever done. What am I going to do in the private sector? And it makes me want to pull out what little hair I have left, pull it out, because that means so much. It's not about what you've done functionally. So Verizon doesn't care if you've been a firearms instructor, if you've been an explosive ordnance expert, if you've been, they don't care about any of that. What they care about, you'll see on the first slide here, these are the skills, your leadership skills, organizational skills, your interpersonal skills, all the things that were required to make you a good cop, to make you a good sergeant, a good lieutenant, a good captain, or a good chief. That's what they're looking at. I had one chief who he had 5 bullets, 29 words to describe his current job, and one of them said that he was CPR qualified. I'm thinking, man, you are the senior executive of that police department, and you're telling me about being CPR qualified. That's great. That's great if we have to use that, but that's not what we're looking for. This is what we're looking for. We're looking for these kinds of skills which police officers and the law enforcement community has in abundance. So you make a rich you make a rich candidate for any company. And again, what's important to understand, though, is you're not going to be rewarded for all the kind of cool stuff you did as a cop or as an FBI agent or DEA agent or U.S. Marshal. That 26-year-old HR specialist, and I want to make that point, that's who's going to see your resume first. A 26-year-old HR specialist. It's not going to be somebody like me or somebody like you, Neil, who has an appreciation for all the acronyms and all the police talk. A 26-year-old doesn't know if task force means 3 people or 33 people or anything beyond or in between.
Okay, all right. Did we want to start with any polling? What do you think, Michael?
That would be fine, because it'd be interesting to know where the audience is relative to this eventual transition.
Okay. Laura's already got it up. She's ahead of the curve.
Oh, fantastic.
So the first question, when will you be transitioning out of law enforcement? Folks, if you would take just a few minutes, you've got 4 responses there in 0 to 3 years, and 3 to 6, and 6 to 9, and 10 plus years. If you could just take a minute or two and kind of signal to us where you are in this potential transition period in your life. So if at 10 years, Mike, should I be thinking 10 years out?
I think absolutely you should be thinking about that. You should be thinking about what's that next stage? Where am I going to go? And I think this presentation is relevant whether it's 10 years plus or it's 0 to 3 years. I think what you're going to be hearing is relevant because you've got to be thinking about that, knowing that most of us are looking forward to the day when we make that transition. Regardless of how much we love what we're doing now, it's an opportunity. In law enforcement, you get to retire when, like you said earlier, you're still young, you're still fit, and it's a time to maybe move on to other professional adventures.
Okay, all right. What do you think, Mike? Anything on that survey stand out or strike you as unusual?
Well, it's interesting. I'm actually pleased to see that the number of people who are 10 years plus, because that's usually not a large component of most audiences that I address. But I think they're thinking the right thing. It's like I love seeing a college freshman talking to me about jobs at Verizon. Still got 3 years to go, but they're thinking about, okay, how do I lead a purposeful college career? Same thing here. How do you lead a purposeful law enforcement career? What can you do now that's going to make you a better candidate 10 years from now or 3 years from now?
Okay. If I've waited until I'm in that 0 to 3 year range, am I too late?
No, not by any stretch of the imagination. When you call me and you've got 2 weeks to go, you tell me, hey, Mike, I'm retiring at the end of May. I think, okay, lots of luck. But 0 to 3 years, that's actually a great time to start considering what you're going to be doing. And one thing I'd say about your resume, start working on that 5 years out. Just if you're doing nothing more than collecting stories that you're proud of, things that you can put, and we'll talk about that in a minute, about how we translate the law enforcement experience into private sector speak. But you don't want to have to, after 25 years, be thinking, what have I ever done? You've done a ton of stuff. You've done a ton of stuff. And what you don't want to be caught with is trying to remember that.
Okay. All right. Yeah. How do I know if I'm a good fit for a position, Mike?
Well, it's a good question. And as this slide shows, I think there's only one relevant question you have to ask yourself to start out. You've read all the job qualifications. Am I qualified to do that job? Once you say yes to that, then you can start the process. And I would tell people, and especially, and I'm going to say this for this audience, especially for the females in the audience, it's funny thing about the difference between men and women with qualifications. I'll have men that I'm mentoring, if they have the first qualification, they think they are made for the job. And a woman I'm mentoring, if she doesn't have qualification number 8, she says, I don't know if I can put in for that job. Ridiculous. The first 2 are usually non-negotiable. The first 2 qualifications you read. As it goes on and on and on, it's building the ideal candidate. Okay, the ideal candidate is usually not out there. So like with anything, it's going to be who's the best candidate in the universe of candidates who have applied. So I would never deselect myself. And again, when you hear questions like, well, do you have any private sector experience or do you have any international experience? All that international experience question means is, can you move from one location to another and come up to speed very quickly? Lots of police officers have done that, moving from one precinct to another with totally different duties, and they come up to speed. If you're a state trooper, then you move maybe to different parts of the state, particularly as you've ascended up the ladder. So that question is. So you don't want to stop there. And if somebody says international experience, you don't want to say no. You don't ever want to answer a question with just a flat no. You want to say, I may not have any international experience, but let me tell you what I think that means. Do I have an ability to move from one environment to another environment and very quickly adapt to that new environment, adapt to that new culture? I would say every law enforcement official in the audience today has that capability.
Okay, all right. Is there?
Oh, Neil, can I say one more thing?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Absolutely critical. You have to make your resume reflect that you can do the job. Don't do your resume in a vacuum and think that I've done all this cool stuff. And so as a result, I'm going to be a shining candidate for this job. You have to make sure your resume speaks to the job qualification. So I would say, I get one of the questions I get, or one of the statements I get more than any other, Neil, is people will say, Mike, with 25 years in law enforcement, I can't believe I didn't get a call back. And then when I see the job qualifications and I see their resume, I say, this is why you didn't get a call back. You didn't answer the first 3 questions in the job qualification.
Okay.
So that means in this day of Word and everything else, don't submit necessarily the same, don't shotgun it. Do it based on job qualifications. It doesn't mean you have to rewrite your resume. It just means you have to tweak it. You have to tweak it a little bit. Think of it like a NASCAR race car. How do I get 5 more miles to the gallon? Well, I tweak the, whatever it is they tweak. But that's what you have to do with your resume. Make it speak to the job qualifications.
Okay. So as the applicant, is it up to me, Mike, to make sure that I'm translating what my job experience is, so that 26-year-old person sitting in employee relations is reading what the translation? Is that what it is?
It absolutely is. The worst thing you could do is assume that people will know what it means when you say, I'm a deputy chief. Something that all of us understand. Or I was the head of a task force. Or I led a HIDA task force. They're not going to know what that means. They're not going to know if you're talking about 3 people or 15. So what I say when I talk about functional and skill-based resume, we tend to put in the functional things we did. So I thought I'd use as an example baseball and football. If you look at baseball, if you look at all those bullets under baseball, man, that's a player I want on my team. But if that player is using that resume to apply for a position on a football team, the coach is going to sit back, rub his thumbs over his belly and say, why would I be interested in that? We don't wear gloves. We don't steal bases. We don't have batting averages. So what you have to do is say, okay, I'm a leader on every team. I'm physically strong, great overall athleticism. I'm mentally tough. I'm committed. I'm goal-oriented. Okay, those are all the things I want as a football coach. That's what I want. If you just use the baseball things, it's not going to be interesting. So if you're a police officer and your resume leads off with you're on a SWAT team and you're also EOD qualified, Verizon's going to say, okay, but we don't do those things. So you have to say, what capabilities did you have that made you good on the SWAT team? What was it about being on an EOD and your interactions with other people, your collaboration with other agencies that made you a potent EOD representative from your department? That's what I'm talking about. And by the way, just to get to the end, I have 3 documents that I'm willing to send, and Laura has those that she can send to any member of the audience that wants them, and we'll talk about that maybe at the end. But one of them talks about translating. So I don't want your audience to be left with, well, what does translating mean? I've got a document I'm going to share with you, shows exactly what I'm talking about.
Okay, so I don't want to get in, and that is another way to think about this. I don't want to get in the weeds of what I've done as a police officer. What I want to do is be able to talk about those skills that I actually exhibited when I was in the position.
Right. Well, you think about something like conflict resolution.
Okay.
My son's been on the police department. He's been on the Washington State Trooper 5 years, and he's done lots of conflict resolution already. That is a skill. Knowing how to step into a dynamic situation and neutralize that situation is an important skill. Not letting your ego get in the way. That happens in the private sector every day. The men and women on this call, this webinar, many of them have participated in task forces that have officers from all around the city or from all around the county. They may have federal agencies on board. They may have a sheriff's office on board. They may have 3 or 4 municipal police departments on board. You got to get all of those people who are differently motivated, differently skilled, and you've got to make them work like a well-oiled machine. So think of yourself as a conductor, and that's the orchestra. You got to make them all play beautiful music. That happens in the private sector every day of the week. That's what's important, not how many doors you kicked down or how many subjects you dragged in or got convicted. That you're going to lose interest with that, but not about what made that an effective task force.
Okay.
Gentlemen,
So go ahead.
we have a couple of questions, and I think I'm going to stop sharing the PowerPoint while we show this. But the first question says, I'm looking specifically in what private sectors Fortune 500 companies are looking for. I obviously have a wealth of knowledge within my law enforcement background. How do I separate myself and my experiences from someone who doesn't have that law enforcement experience?
Good question.
Well, first of all, the fact that you come from law enforcement, they're going to understand that you know how, if that's important for the role you're applying for, whether it's security, but you should also think about ethics. You should think about EEO. You should think about a number of entities within an organization, even auditing, that require investigative acumen. So don't just think security, first of all. That's why it's important to talk about your skills, because those skills are applicable outside of just security. That may be where your highest market value is, which is something I found out when I was making my own transition, but it's not the only place we can go. So what you need to do is make yourself an attractive candidate for that position, not necessarily an attractive ex-police officer for that position. Think of yourself as a competitive candidate. And I think that will help you. And again, the documents that I sent to you, Laura, that you can share with the audience, that's going to help you, because I really walk you through it line by line what I'm talking about.
Okay. We do have another question as well. Do you believe that some public associations are afraid to hire former law enforcement or former military?
Great question. And I have a great little story to share that is really relevant to that question. One of my friends applied for a job, and I saw her resume, which looked like she was applying for her next job in the FBI, not her job in the private sector. So she said to me, she finally sent me an email, and she said, Mike, at the end of the day, I think they just didn't want to hire an FBI agent. And I told her, bingo, you're exactly right. That's not what they want to hire. They want to understand that you have the ability to come in and work in a different culture. And I can assure you, Verizon is a different culture than the FBI. They want to make sure that you understand something about their business. What are their interests? So I would tell everybody, if you're applying and you got an interview, get the annual report. Don't read all the boilerplate stuff, but read the stuff he really cares about. Do they care about diversity? Do they care about other aspects of the job that you can speak to? That's what you want to talk to. I knew Verizon. Let me tell you a cute, funny story. I knew Verizon. A lot of their annual report talked about diversity. So when I was in my interview, the CEO said to me, he said, Mike, are you a Jets fan? Because he's a diehard Jets fan. And I said, no, I'm not. As a matter of fact, I'm a diehard Chicago Bears fan, and always will be. And he said, he scratched his chin and he said, Chicago Bears. Now, at the time, Verizon had over 240,000 employees. He said, I don't know if we have any Chicago Bear fans anywhere in the company. And I said to him, having read all that they care about diversity, I said, well, you know, Ivan, I know how much the company cares about diversity. Perhaps it's time that you diversify your fan base. He loved that. So it was a lighthearted comment, but it told him I had done my homework and I was ready. So that's what I would say. Make sure you know something about just like when we go into court, we don't want to be asked any question we don't know the answer to. Think that same way when you're going into an interview. You don't have to know everything about the company, and you never will. But you have to basically know that Verizon doesn't build backhoes.
Okay. Very good. Very good. Okay. All right. There you go. I know you've got a genuine passion for assisting members of the law enforcement community. Can you tell the audience about some of the common mistakes, Michael, that you see on resumes?
Absolutely, Neil. And I will tell the entire audience, everything I talk about in this presentation is real. It doesn't come from a Harvard book. It doesn't come from a Yale book. It's not nothing against those who find institutions. It does, but it's not theoretical. Everything I'm talking about, I've seen over and over and over again. When I say presenting a job description instead of a resume, it's when you speak in the third person and you have bullet after bullet after bullet. I've even sent some people's resumes back to them, making it look like a job description, and that's not what you want. It's not a description. It's a description of the things you've done. I've got a little saying at the end of this that I think is most relevant. Again, listing positions held 20 years ago. If you are the chief, if you are a lieutenant, if you are a captain, if you are a sergeant, I'm going to make an assumption. I'm going to go out on a limb and assume you've been to an academy somewhere. So you don't have to tell me about your academy. In the military, I'm very proud that I was a United States Marine, or once a Marine, always a Marine. I'm proud I'm a Marine. But what I put down was United States Marine Corps, 1980 to 1985 captain. Boom, that was it. If you think that somebody wants to read what you did 20 years ago, not going to happen. Let me tell you a fact that I know from talking with all of my colleagues. If I'm not excited by your resume in the first 2/3 of the first page, I'm unlikely to read the second page and forget about a third page. So again, you want to make sure that you spend the most time talking about what you've done in the last 5 to 7 years, because that's why I'm going to hire you. Whether it's as a senior investigator, a manager, a director, a VP, that's why I'm going to hire you. What you've done in the last 5 to 7 years. And I use the thing on my own resume, an excerpt of which is part of what I sent Laura, and she'll send to all of you. I said I've held additional positions in the FBI. I went back 6 years. I said I've held additional positions in the FBI and served as an officer in the United States Marine Corps prior. I said additional information will be provided upon request. I never got one request, not one request for additional information. You can talk about that stuff in the interview, but you don't necessarily need it on your resume. Now, the only thing I change, Neil, is if they are applying for something in another law enforcement agency. Okay. So if you're applying to be a deputy chief in another department, they may want to know you're a cop's cop. Then it matters. But if you're coming to a private sector company like Verizon, it doesn't matter as much. So EOD, SWAT, polygrapher, ERT, when you're listing all those functions, if they're not relevant, they're not relevant. They're not adding heft to your package. That's what you want to do. You want to make that thing say, wow, I want this person. I want this lady. I want this guy. And so again, you want to customize the resume to fit the vacancy announcement, and then failure to translate skill sets. Okay. And position inflation, be real careful about that. There have been a lot of owners of the anthrax case in the FBI. You want to be careful about that. If you were the case agent, great. If you were a helper and provided critical support, that's good too. Okay. But you just want to, you want to make sure that whatever else you do, you are candid and transparent in your resume. I mean, an absolute killer of a resume is to put something on it that we learn is not true. Okay. So do you see position? Oh, Laura's putting up another poll for us. Let's take a look here. When's the last time you worked on your resume? Okay. So we've got a couple of options here. What resume? Okay. There's probably a few people in the audience that are saying, what's a resume? I update my resume every 6 months. I update my resume once a year. I update my resume when I need a new position. So those are the options, and we'll take a few minutes and let folks weigh in on that. So do you see position inflation often, Michael? Is it something that you see with any frequency? I don't see it. I'll be honest with you, and this may upset some folks. I don't see it. I see it on the federal side more than I see it on the officer side, because somebody will say I was a captain. Somebody will say I was a sergeant. I was a lieutenant. When somebody doesn't put their position and they say senior executive, I want to know what that position was. I want to know what that was, because if you're a supervisor in Little Rock, it doesn't necessarily make you a senior executive. Okay. So that's important. Okay. There's I'm pleased here that that only 4% said what resume. And I really think this question is more germane depending on where you are on the transition timeline, if you will. So if you are less than 3 years out, you should have a resume on a Word file somewhere, and you should look at it over and over and over again. I can assure you this, I probably took 8 months to write my resume. One of the things I was after was to make sure I didn't make any mistakes, because I'll tell you folks, I'll forgive one typo. But when I get to the fifth typo, I'm thinking, okay, this is a reflection of that person's work ethic. And five typos is likely to get you into the round file. So don't think, and this is a hard thing to understand sometimes. You think, well, my God, I've been undercover, I've been shot at, I've done this and I've done that. What are you talking about, 5 typos? You got to understand, I don't know all of that. I'm comparing you to every other resume I have, and your resume, to the extent possible, grammatically and spelling and everything else should be as close to perfect as anything you've ever produced. And I can't tell you how many times I've read a line. I remember once my secretary said, read that line. I read it. She said, read it again, because I read it the way it was in my mind. Then she said, read it out loud. And Neil, I'm embarrassed to say, reading it out loud, I caught it. And I said, oh my God, she popped me in the back of my head. And but that's what you have to do, because it's the first impression I'm going to have of you. And so it needs to be the best impression. You know, when I think about professional resume writers, because maybe somebody has that question out there, I think of them as being experts in presentation, but you should own your own content.
Okay.
To make that distinction. Don't let a resume writer tell you what should be on your resume. One of my Verizon colleagues had on her resume, received an appointment to the FBI Academy, but due to family considerations, couldn't accept the appointment. And I said, what's that there for? That's like saying I wanted to go to med school, but couldn't afford the cost.
Right.
Okay. You never went. I don't know if you would have succeeded. I don't know if you would have had a great career. I don't even know if you'd have made it through the academy. So she's trying to get cachet associated with the Bureau, having never been there. So don't let a professional resume writer pump air into your resume, because you all don't need that. You don't need it now.
Okay. Very, very good.
Michael,
good.
we do just have a question about general rules in terms of the length of a resume. There are a lot of trainings and different educational things that officers do have to do throughout their careers. How many pages should they keep their resume to, if they can?
That's a good question, Laura. And going back to my original comment, the traditional 2-page is 2.5 max. If there's a group, if there's a community from which I have received as much as a 7-page resume, military is probably most guilty of that, but law enforcement would be a close second. And the reality is, most of the people reading that resume don't care about anything past page 2. Really, in the first 2/3 of the first page of your resume, I should be excited about seeing you. So it's not a place to capture everything you've ever done. And remember, the resume is the key to the interview, not the key to the job. It's the key to having me invite you in to show you the relative importance. If I'm inviting you in to talk to you about a director position or a VP position, I don't even have your resume on my desk. I'm done with that. I've already made the assessment that you can technically do the job. Now it's about chemistry. It's about whether you fit in with us. And we're going to talk a little bit about interviews in a minute, but that's what I'm really after. How do you fit with my team? You could be the smartest guy in the world, but be the kind of person who would turn off my team in half a heartbeat. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. I'll ask people, you've had an employee who heretofore has been a rock star for you, but you've noticed in the past 6 months that their performance has gone way down. Well, I've had people answer that question, well, just because they're a friend of mine or they're a previous rock star doesn't mean I wouldn't fire them. But that's not the answer I'm looking for. The best answer I got for that is somebody said to me, one applicant said to me, Mr. Mason, may I say something? I said, absolutely. He said, I can't deal with that question because it wouldn't take me 6 months to realize the wheels were getting wobbly. It would take me a week or 2 weeks. That's the kind of relationship I want with my people. Oh my God. He knocked several balls out of the park with that one response, because I want to know that people care about people. I run a big department. I have over 600 employees, another 200 contractors, and then I'm responsible for roughly 2,100 security officers around the world. I don't do 99% of that work. It's done by my people. So I'm very focused on you being a people person, not a tough guy, tough lady, not anything like that. I'm focused on how do you take care of your people. We can all be tough when we have to be, but I'm looking for some compassion.
Very good. Very good. Okay, so a couple of final thoughts here, Michael. Where are you going to take us here?
Well, I think the most important one is the bottom one. A resume is not a job description. It's a description of how you have succeeded in your job. That's what I want to know. I think of this community, this LEEDA group. You all are Bentleys, and I don't want to see you coming into my shop looking like a Chevette. And I say that with love in my heart because that was my first new car, a Chevette, and I was very proud of it. But you all are Bentleys. And so, you know, you need to make sure, look at all of these bullets. And that last one is an important one. A hastily prepared resume looks like one. This is why when you're in the zone, especially if you're already eligible to retire, you may think, no, I'm gonna do this another 5 years. Then somebody whispers something in your ear and you're thinking, holy cow, that can do things for me that I hadn't even thought of financially. And you may be ready to jump out. What you don't want to do is do a resume in 2 days and send that to that person, because that's going to be full of the mistakes I talked about. And that's not going to be a good scene. It really isn't. It's hard to overcome that first impression. You want it to be rock solid.
Okay. Laura, did you have a question?
Okay. I did not, but I'm curious if we should run the last poll before we get into some of the questions to get an idea of our audience.
Okay, let's go ahead and run that one then. On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you in finding a good job after you retire from your role in law enforcement? 1 being not confident and 10 being extremely confident. So Michael, we'll get a good range here on our audience and see how they are, if they're confident about getting a job and having life after policing. So really, when we're in that zone, Michael, I mean, it's one of those things where we keep that resume fresh. We put a lot of, you know, we're working on it, looking at it. It's got to be the document that gets us the interview. And that's part of your message, right?
That's absolutely correct. It has to be that.
Okay. All right.
And then I'm really interested in seeing this poll because I see it's tailoring down toward the, well, no, it's good. It's good in the 8-7 range.
Okay.
I think if I have an objective, it's 2 things. Number 1, getting a job in the private sector is a job unto itself. Number 2, the private sector security community is a rapidly maturing community. There used to be a day you came out as a captain, you came out as a lieutenant, you came out as a chief, you could walk into one of these jobs. Now you've got people who've been on my team who've been in security for 20 years. Wow. So they bring bucketfuls of company experience, but you all bring bucketfuls of experience on the outside, how to interface with other police agencies. You bring a number of different skills to the table. But I want all of you all, when you get to that point and you get that solid resume, to think very, very positively, to think I am ready for this, I have prepared for this, and I am confident in having success in this endeavor.
Okay. All right. Okay, so we've got the resume. Now I'm ready. You know, I've done a good job on my resume, and so now I get the call. They're inviting me in. So let's change focus. And I know you believe that the interview is the deal closer when it comes to being selected for a new job. What are some of the most important things that you think are critical components in a successful interview?
Well, one thing, starting out with the title page, no time to leave anything on the bench. I remember when we did FBI interviews, we knew the person's name, and that was basically all, because the FBI wanted to get out of the, you know, if somebody went to Notre Dame and their dad was a cop, they automatically, boom, rubber stamped in. They wanted to neutralize that effect. So all we knew was somebody coming in. And I remember one young man was an F-18 fighter pilot, and he never brought that up during his interview. I mean, he had a great interview, ended up getting a job, but he never once brought that up, assuming that we knew that. And I would say, with your interview panel, don't assume that they know anything about you. Then we can go to the first slide.
Okay.
Laura, do you want me to answer that question? Oh, okay. I'll go on then.
Sure, you can answer it if you would like.
it went away before I actually had a chance to read it. It was from Ernesto.
Yes, Ernesto's question was Michael. What are your thoughts regarding experience versus degrees? I have an oral board interview for promotions and testing, but I'm worried about the degree versus experience and if in the private sector, the degree holds more weight.
I will say this, at a company like Verizon, a degree matters. But if you get to that interview point, don't talk about that as a weak point in your background. Let the interviewer decide that. You need to go in with a strong interview. Why do you think you are a good fit for this job? That's what you want to talk about. You don't ever want to be apologetic. You want to make it sound like, I mean, you know, degrees are one thing. Verizon at one time was hiring only people with degrees, but it didn't matter if it was in Russian history. It didn't have anything to do with the job. So don't get wrapped around the axle about, I don't have a degree. Deal with that. Deal with that. But what you want to bring is that degree of experience you have. That is what you have. So going to this slide, which it sort of dovetails into that question, preparation is absolutely your only ally. People think, well, I know about me, I know about my history, I don't have to prepare, I'm good. I can tell in 5 minutes somebody who prepared for an interview and somebody who didn't. You need to have a plan. You need to own that interview. It's not about your law enforcement career. I can't emphasize that enough. It's about the value you believe you are going to bring to that company. It is about becoming a partner in that department or the head of that department or whatever position you're in. It's about how are you going to bring value to that position. So when I say learn as much about the posted position, you don't have to call people in that company, but call your friends, network with other people who've left your agency or who now are working somewhere else. Tell them, what is the position involved? So that when you're talking, you have a basic understanding of the role you're going into. And like I said, depending on the level, if you're going for a chief security officer position like mine, let's say you're a chief, deputy chief, or even a senior captain, you want to make sure that you understand something about the company. What's important to that company? Try to understand the significant challenges that they may be faced by. And then when you have an interview, it's a conversation. It's not like the interviews we do as law enforcement officials. You're not coming in on bended knee. You're coming in with a bucket of experience. You can barely manage the bucket, it's so big. So don't come in on bended knee like a 22-year-old college graduate. You are talking with your colleagues, and that's how you want to come across. Very confident. You want to come across very articulate. You want to come across as if you have prepared. And one thing I tell people, have 5 things you want to share with the interviewers. 5 things about yourself. You don't have to overly script it, but when you leave that room, what do you want them to know about you, especially if you believe that's a differentiator between you and all the other candidates.
Okay.
Oh, and Laura, if you could hit the button, there's one more little tagline. Oh, well, anyway, it said you may not be asked a single, oh, there it is. You may not be asked a single question about your work experience as a police officer. And that's what I want to emphasize. They're going to ask you situational questions, but it's about that leadership, communication skills, interpersonal skills, oral communication skills, maybe I repeated that, and then your ability to work cross-functionally. That is, if you're going into a security position, that's as important as anything, because I touch the entirety of Verizon. So you want to talk about that. So you really do want to prepare for this interview. Don't assume because you know yourself, you know your job, you're ready to go. You probably are not, but you want it to be conversational and you want to own that interview. I expect the applicant to do 80% of the talking. It's okay to be funny too. God knows cops have lots of funny stories. All right.
Okay, good. What about the dynamics of the actual interview, Michael? How do we get the giant question mark that's over our head when we walk in that room? How do we get that evaporated and moved?
Well, remember a couple of things. I would like to say that every company prepares as much to interview as I'm telling you all to prepare to be interviewed. And that's not necessarily true. Sometimes they're pulling colleagues. Hey, Neil, hey, Laura, can you come sit with me this afternoon at 2 o'clock? I got to interview somebody. And so sometimes they are not well prepared. Use that. Also, if it's a chief security officer position or a deputy chief or even a director, they may not have filled one of those positions in the last 10 years. So be aware of that. You may be interviewed by 3 people who have never replaced that person. So you want to make sure that you have ideas about, what you would do. You want to convey confidence. You want to have that voice quality. You want to be comfortable, in your own skin. You want to be who you are. Like I said, the interview, by the time you get to the interview, it's more about chemistry than competency. We've already figured out the competency part. So now it's about chemistry. It's about talking with people. It's about making sure little things that I used to tell FBI applicants, don't just look at the male agent on the panel, which happens a lot. It doesn't matter who asked the question, that happens a lot. So you want to make sure you don't do that. But the bottom line is, like I say, you may be interviewed by individuals whose experience is substantially less than yours, both in the company and certainly in law enforcement. So that's your chance to wow them. But like if you're talking about an arrest you had to make, they're not interested in the arrest. What they're interested in is the human factor of that. I had one of my people who was on the job, and I thought he was a little tired. I wanted to make sure before we did this that he was on his game, that he had his game face on. That's the kind of thing that they're interested in. If you're talking about a subject who you had to turn, how did you turn him? Because they're not interested in the crime. They're not interested in the sentence he got. They're interested in what does your humanity look like? That's what they want to know about. That's what they actually want to know about. But more than anything, it is showtime. When you walk in there, you have to feel like it is showtime. Let me give you an example of one question my CEO asked me. He asked me where I live. They wanted everybody to live in New Jersey, Basking Ridge, New Jersey. Well, they wanted them to live in New Jersey because our headquarters was in Basking Ridge, New Jersey. I still had family in Virginia and knew I'd be commuting back and forth, although I had an apartment in New Jersey. So I said to him, listen, I know what you're getting at, but let me assure you of this. If you're having a crisis at 1:30 in the morning on a Saturday, you are not going to have to ask, where's your chief security officer? Because I'm going to be standing right next to you. And he loved that kind of answer. You're showing commitment. That's what all of you all have in abundance. Commitment to the mission, commitment to the job. That's what they want to see.
Okay. What's a question that you'd ask of everyone that you've ever interviewed?
One question I ask, and I think Laura has that's I think my final slide, is you have to have a 30 to 60 day plan. I want to know that you've thought about this job. I want to know that you've thought about how you're going to hit the deck and get into this job. The other thing I told my CEO, he told me, and this is a statement that he said actually made him hire me. He said, I know it's going to take you a couple of years to really become effective in the role. And I told him, I have to interrupt you here. I said, if you don't start to see substantive changes in our security posture within 30 to 60 days, you need to look for a new CSO. And he said he'd never seen anybody make that kind of bet on themselves. But that's why you have to have a plan. And I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to ask you, oops, sorry, let me get rid of this. I'm going to ask you, what is your 30 to 60 day plan? And that's another one of the documents that Laura has that she'll send out to the entire audience. And it's generic. It's not a Verizon 30 to 60 day plan or Motorola or General Motors or Ford company. It's the kinds of things I want to know you're thinking about. Because depending on your position, I mean, if you're going to be a director at Verizon, the coin that let me get rid of that. Throw it in the kitchen. Okay. What I want to know is that you have put some thought into how are you going to engage with your partners? How are you going to engage with your teammates? Are you going to be looking for key allies within the company? Are you going to be looking for who are your external allies? Those are the kind of things I want to know. I want you to focus on what our objectives are. And I'll tell you something else. The way I ask the question is, tell me something about your 30 to 60-day plan if you're fortunate enough to be selected for this position. And I've had people say, well, I'm not going to move any people. I'm not going to promote anybody. I'm not going to change our work process. I'm not going to change any of the things that we do on a regular basis. I say, okay, I got that. But my question was, now I know what you're not going to do. What I'm much more interested in is, what are you going to do? So you need to be ready to hit the deck running. And that's how I want you to go into that interview. It's showtime. I'm going to leave these people with the thought that I am the person they want for this job. You have zero to lose. You have absolutely nothing to lose. And let me tell you something, folks. If I invite you in for an interview, you've already rounded third base. Now, there may be 3 or 4 other people who are coming around third base too. So the job isn't yours, but you are weeded out from the 50 who've applied, and now it's down to 4. So if you get that interview, that's really, really an important demarcation point from you and the rest of the interview pool. So be thinking about that and go into this with just a bucket full of confidence, because it's something you all have earned over the course of your career.
If I'm answering that 30 to 60-day question, Michael,
Neil, I can barely hear you. Somehow I lost.
Okay. I said, if I'm trying to answer your 30 to 60-day question, and I talk about spending time getting to know the people in the unit, is that a plus or a minus for you?
Well, if you're saying you're spending time trying to get to know the people in the unit, if you say that's what you're going to do, that's a plus. Not what you've done beforehand. Yeah, but if you say that I'm gonna interview, you might say I'm gonna interview all my direct reports, and I want to find out about their families. I want to find out what they do in their off time, because I want to find out how these people are motivated. I want to find out where they are on the time continuum. If I have somebody who's reputedly a rock star, I want to know, do I have them for the next 6 months or the next 6 years? So those kinds of things, so I can get to know my direct reports, and then I want to know the people beneath them as well.
Okay. I mean, one of the things that we talk about at FBI-LEEDA is leadership relationship leading to a partnership. Would that sort of response ring true in the private sector?
Oh, it absolutely will. I touch all elements of the company, but I've got to have partners. I work for the company. Security is a support element. Now, I don't like it when people say we're just a cost center. If I'm just a cost center, get rid of me. But we enable the business. So we have to work with partners. So we're responsible for what's called Verizon's clearance program. So if we're outsourcing jobs, we're responsible for that process to outsource work. Well, I've got to make sure I understand what the business's timetable is. I've got to make sure I understand what sort of security controls they want in place. And I also have to understand what kind of security controls do I want in place. But we have to work together. I don't ever want security to be viewed as an obstacle or as a hurdle. I want security to be viewed as an ally. That's how you need to talk in the interview. It's not us against them. The employees are not my adversaries, they are my allies. And that's how you need to come across.
Okay. Michael, can you tell us a little bit about the 3 documents that Laura's going to make available to those viewing the webinar? What are they? And go ahead.
Absolutely. One of the documents talks about it's an excerpt. Well, I'll start with that. It's an excerpt of my resume, not because it's the gold standard of anything, but it'll show you 2 things. Number 1, I practice what I preach. And number 2, I would say if you print these documents out, if Laura sends them to you and print them out, print them on a color printer, because I write a sentence and then I write in red why that sentence is important. And I break it down sentence by sentence. If you don't do it on a color printer, you're not going to know, is that part of his resume? Well, that doesn't make any sense. But you'll see it when it's in red. So I talk you through that. Then then the second thing is your 30 to 60-day plan. And it talks about that's about 3 pages, talks in bullets about all the things you ought to be thinking about doing. You don't have to do all of those things, but I want some kind of plan. And then finally, it's the translation document, which I think is probably one of the most valuable things. You'll see that there's a unit chief in the FBI. He applied for a job at Verizon. In his first job, He listed 7 bullets. The problem with the 7 bullets is 6 of them, he was the unit chief of the FBI's informant unit. 6 of those bullets he was never going to do again in his life the day he walked out of the FBI. So what value is that to that 26-year-old HR specialist? Nothing. I'll show you a translation paragraph where I did it in a narrative form. I like narrative more than bullet, but that's a cosmetic thing. People can feel differently. But I'll show you a narrative that I did describing his work where I used the 3 letters FBI only one time. One time. Okay. And that's what I'm talking about when I say translation. Once everybody sees it, I think it'll be crystal clear what that means.
Okay. All right. In this day and age, what sort of jobs, if I'm coming out of law enforcement, what sort of jobs should I be looking for?
Well, depending on your rank, so if you're a chief, maybe you should be looking for a chief security officer, chief, deputy chief, a captain. You might be looking for a chief security officer depending on the size of the company. And then it also depends on the size of your department. So Verizon has a very large, very sophisticated security department. So it's unlikely if you're a sergeant, you're going to come in as a chief security officer. But you could come in as a manager. You could come in as a director, several steps above a manager. But more importantly, there's also compliance, there's EEO, there's ethics, and there's security. So think about elements where there is an investigative acumen required to be good in that job and focus on that as well. Okay. If you've been in a teaching role at an academy, think about that. You could go in our learning and development. So you could come out of a police department, having taught for the last 5 years at your academy, and you could go into our learning and development unit, because we're trying to teach security concepts out to the field. So you'd be a perfect fit for that. So again, I opened with a slide that said the first question you ask yourself is, can I do that job? If the answer is yes, then the next thing is to make sure your resume says I can do that job.
Okay.
Gentlemen, we have a series of questions that I think have come up at a great time as we are coming close to the 1 hour mark. The first one here is for Mr. Mike Mason. Concerning law enforcement, I help hire new officers. What can we do to ensure we don't get the wrong people hired? We are seeing a number of horrible choices of officers being hired and tarnishing the badge. What can we do in this process to weed out the bad seeds?
Well, that's an excellent question. And one of the things I would say is, again, focus not on the technical expertise, but rather on their humanity. If you can find questions that get underneath, how do they feel? I mean, nobody's going to say I'm a white supremacist. Nobody's going to say that in an interview. Nobody's going to say I'm an absolute sexist. Nobody's going to say that. So it really comes through the design of the questions and how deep do you get next to a person's soul. At the risk of sounding corny, I want the best policemen and the best policewomen, best police officers that we can possibly get in this nation, so that we avoid things like the Minneapolis incident. That shouldn't have happened. I want to make sure that a person has sufficient confidence and ego to succeed without their ego being the primary driver behind who they are. So if they're telling me, I'm a black belt in karate, I'm this, that, and the other, I'm not interested in that stuff. I'll learn that later. I want to know how they think about relationships. And one thing the Washington State Patrol did with my son that I thought was really interesting, he had to give them the name of 2 former girlfriends that they wanted to interview. And they interviewed 2 former girlfriends. They wanted to find out, didn't matter why they broke up or anything, and they both said that they were on Team Matthew anyway. It wasn't why they broke up. They wanted to know, was your boyfriend a gentleman? And on the other side, it would be, was your girlfriend, was she polite? Was she this? Was she that? So I think that getting the right people is all about designing the right questions. And I think that in my job now, I make sure I ask the right question. That's why I asked the question about, you've got a top performer, absolute rock star. Now he's not doing as well, not coming to work on time, not looking the same. How do you handle that? Because I want to know, I want to dip into their humanity. I can teach them the job. I want to know their humanity. Same with you all. You're going to teach them how to be police officers. You're going to teach them that. What you want to know is that you're teaching the right person. So I really appreciate that question.
Yeah. The other thing, if I can weigh in just a second, Laura, is under all circumstances, do not lower your standards. I mean, we can look at the history of U.S. policing where departments under certain pressures lowered their standards, and almost to an agency, within 5 to 10 years, that agency is dealing with major acts of misconduct. So I know that the pool right now is it's a really tight pool. It's hard to get the great kids coming into these positions, but you're much better off not lowering your standards to accept somebody who may give you a lot of heartburn in the not too distant future. So that would be kind of the other 2 cents I would weigh in here.
That's why it also pays to have a recruiting program that starts when kids are in grade school.
Yep.
And in high school. I wouldn't pass up any opportunity to talk to a young group of high school freshmen. And I wouldn't care about sounding corny. I'd say, this is what we want in our police department. If you start with the universe as 21, 22 eligible, we're a little bit too late.
Yep, I agree. Any other questions, Laura?
I think we are good on the question front. I just want to take the time to thank Mike Mason for joining us. You are doing wonderful things for our industry as well as the private sector. Congratulations on all of your accomplishments, and we were so happy to have you join us. The same with, of course, our Director of Curriculum, Dr. Neil Moore. Thank you all, the attendees, for joining us. This webinar will be recorded and posted to our social media platforms, as well as our website. Visit FBI-LEEDA.org for any additional questions.
Laura, I'd just like to say thank you so much for inviting me. I mean, it was a real honor to address this audience.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Michael.
Yep.